Hey guys, Tyler here, and thank you for checking out this video. And with Season 4 almost upon us, this is the perfect opportunity to do a retrospective on Season 3. So today we're going to be chatting really quick about what I thought about Season 3, what I liked about it, what I didn't, and then comparing and contrasting my favorite and my least favorite for both Mythic Plus and for Raid. So, let's get started.
Mr. Eggplant presents.
This first section is going to be about my favorite Mythic Plus dungeons from Season 3. And coming in at number 2 is going to be Halls of Atonement. So Halls of Atonement is one of my favorite keys just in general, just because it's one of those dungeons that's rather short, that you front load most of the trash in the dungeon, and then that means you can just absolutely pump damage, and that is something that marksman hunters obviously love to do. I had my best pulls in this particular run this season, but honestly, the main reason this jumped up a couple of places into my top 2 would be because this was the first key that Drexit timed at a 20 or better ever. They did such a great job. We were going in there and just decided, hey, we are going to try this plus 20 key, and they timed it. So that really made an impact on me. It was such a fun experience, and that's really what I get out of this game, is more of the fun experiences I have with other players versus the game itself. And I decided against doing any honorable mentions for Mythic Plus dungeons, so my number 1 dungeon for this season was Tazavesh So Leah's Gambit, which was one of the 2 new dungeons that were added here in Season 3. And maybe it's just because we had a really nice affix in Encrypted for Season 3, but I really enjoyed Solia's Gambit. It's a pretty short dungeon, which can be problematic if you do wipe, but I had different groups that did 2 different runs throughout the dungeon, where we woe skipped all the way and did the trash at the end, and we did trash at the beginning. So either way, I really enjoy this particular dungeon, and I enjoy the bosses as well. They're pretty unique, and there's some really quotable lines like, "Our captain's a dragon!" That's one of my favorite things, and if you watch any of my Mythic Plus runs, I always quote it to my group every time we pull Hooktail. I just feel like Solia's Gambit has a lot of character, and really Tazavesh does in a whole, so because of that, it makes the top of my list for Season 3. Now that we've talked about the cream of the crop, in my opinion, for the dungeons for Mythic Plus, now let's talk about the bottom of the barrel. And the bottom 2 are pretty usual suspects. In fact, they are the same bottom 2, I think, for each season so far. And then coming in at number 2 is going to be Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths I just find to be rather difficult for the groups that I've done keys with. For whatever reason, there's not a ton of upgrades as well, which doesn't help any. The second and third boss in particular I find difficult, that third boss even more so. I think this dungeon would look a little bit more favorable on my list if the third boss wasn't as difficult as it is for marksman hunters. I cut my teeth on a timed plus 23 in there this last season, and let me tell you, that third boss is so brutal if you are a squishy marksman hunter. It really causes you to use all of the tools in your kit, and even you can do everything right and still die. And then also the gauntlet going to the last boss I find very difficult, especially if you want to pick up on that very first skip with the encrypted affix. And coming in at number 1 for my bottom 2 Mythic Plus dungeons for this season is going to be Theater of Pain. And who knew, whenever I got into the beta, I only did 1 dungeon and only tested out 1 dungeon, which was Theater of Pain. Little did I know that I would be testing out one of my least favorite dungeons for the entire expansion so far. In Theater, there's just a lot of wombo combo things that can happen to your group, and the spawn points are a little weird as well, particularly if you're really deep into Zav's wing or really deep into the Lich's wing. It just takes forever and you lose so much time. I know that is built into the timer. It feels extra brutal if you do end up wiping, and your average group will probably wipe at least once in a Mythic Plus dungeon. But other than that, I was playing a Necrolord Marksman Hunter, which was kind of a saving grace for this, even though it is still the least played and least favorite for me here in Season 3. Just means I was always able to get into a Mythic Plus run, since I was one of the few people playing Necrolord Marksman Hunter at the beginning of the season. So now that we've looked at the dungeons, let's look at the Mythic Plus affixes for each season. So far here in Shadowlands, we've had 3 seasons, and Season 3, which was encrypted, has been my favorite so far, and I give it either a B+ or an A-. And if ranking the affixes, I would give Encrypted the first place, then Prideful from Season 1, and then Tormented from Season 2. And other than Awakened from Season 4 of BFA, the Encrypted buff has been my favorite so far. It gives you nice flexibility in your runs. Having either Vi, or Woe allows different groups to do different things in the same dungeon, and I always appreciate that when it comes to a seasonal affix. It was one of the reasons I liked Awakened so much. And then as for the other two, Prideful is pretty kind of bland, honestly, but I guess you could say Tormented and Prideful were kind of equal. And now that we've taken a look at Mythic Plus, let's take a look at raiding in Season 3, which was the Sepulcher of the First One's raid. And before I dive into the bottom 2 raid fights, I will preface this by saying one thing. I really did enjoy this raid tier. In fact, it was my favorite raid tier this expansion. Kind of a spoiler for later in the video. I didn't really feel like there was any terrible fights. There were 3 in my mind that were overtuned, and even in the Mythic World first race, you could definitely tell that. And some of these fights were rather boring, and these bottom 2 are at least in my opinion, the 2 most boring fights. They felt like they decided to design the fight based around the mythic boss encounter and then kind of peeled away some of the mechanics. So when you got to normal and heroic, for example, Designe, which is the second lowest in my tier list, is just a rather boring fight, and there wasn't a lot to it. And in fact, we figured out a way that you could cheese it very early on in the tier with having immunities, so you didn't even have to worry about one of the main mechanics in the fight. And then much like Designe, coming in at number 1 as the bottom 2 raid fights here in Sepulcher was the Vigilant Guardian. And I have to say, if I were to do the Mythic Vigilant Guardian fight, I actually really enjoyed that. That felt like a full encounter where even the heroic version of Vigilant Guardian feels like you're just standing around. I know that we had been clearing it for months at this point, and I do know that it's the first boss of the raid, but compared to some others in past tiers and expansions, much like Scorpibro from the very beginning of Nighthold, or even the Annihilator at the beginning of Antorus, they felt like fleshed out fights where in Vigilant Guardian, I know it's a glorified ad fight, but you kind of stand around for most of it. So it is rather boring, so because of that, both Designe and Vigilant Guardian take the Golden Razzie Award, I suppose, for boss fights this season. Now let's go ahead and talk about my top 3 favorite raid fights for Sepulcher, the first ones. And I do have an honorable mention, so it's technically top 4, but it's only the heroic version of Halandris. And just because Halandris is not a good fight for marksman, there is so much movement. In fact, that was one of the few fights that I ended up playing Venthyr on, since you can at least have the dot on the boss as much as possible. But the heroic version, I really appreciated the death beams, like the entire walls of death beams at the very end of the fight. This is just a fun encounter. I like the ones that look visually appealing, have different mechanics, and then also really push me to try to do better, especially on fights that maybe my class and spec struggle with. So now into the official top 3 for Sepulcher raid encounters for myself. So coming in at number 3 was Artificer Zymox. So we first, of course, saw Zymox as a raid encounter in Castle Nathria, and I enjoyed that fight, and I enjoyed this fight. This fight is actually completely different, so we do have a lot of adds, which you will notice the fights that I choose as my favorite are probably ones that marksman hunters really excel at. I didn't get to do this fight on Mythic, but I did get to watch several of my friends progress on it, and man, that fight looked a lot of fun. But as for the heroic version, I really liked the portal mechanic and having to make sure you bait the traps, and then of course in heroic, the traps not going away makes it just all that much more difficult. Then coming in at number 2 on my list is going to be the Lords of Dread encounter, which could have been the penultimate boss of Sepulcher, depending on if you fought them or Rygalon first. And Lords of Dread was perfect for a Night Fae Marksman Hunter, which I played mostly in this raid tier. So the cooldowns lined up perfectly to see all the big damage on those swarm phases, and then also the Among Us phase was one of my favorite mechanics of this whole tier. I don't remember if they've done it in previous tiers. If they have, please leave me a comment down below and remind me so I can go check out that fight again. Then coming in at number 1 on my list is going to be the Anduin fight from Sepulcher. So it had so many mechanics, especially for just like a normal / heroic raid boss. There was way more than your average 8th raid boss in a tier. So because of that, he was most likely the original end boss, but since the final raid ended up getting cut, they just tacked on the Jailer, Rygalon, and Lords of Dread after that, which means this guy is no joke. He was so much fun. I liked the Kingsmorn phases. You had the walls of dead that are slowly walking towards you on heroic. You had to make sure and kill the A-bomb in a timely manner. And of course, you got to see all the big damage from your marksman hunters and survival hunters for that matter. Because of that, and this was a fun fight because it allowed me to break out Necrolord marksman hunter. It doesn't get played very much in raid settings, but this fight had so much cleave and it was able to be used to perfection. And because of that, it's my number 1 fight of the tier. And wrapping this video up, I wanted to compare the raid tiers themselves to one another. So as you can see on the screen, unfortunately for Sylvanas, the Sanctum of Domination is the worst for me. I have to kind of retcon something I said in my Season 2 video. I actually said I liked Sanctum better than Castle Nathria, but after I've thought about it and the whole Shards of Domination nonsense and some of those fights just not being fun in the Sanctum, I have said that Sanctum is going to be 3rd, then Castle Nathria at 2, and then actually the Sepulcher at number 1. But as you can see there on Sire Denathrius's chest there, he still gets a red / gold ribbon, I guess, for being the favorite fight out of the 3 AOTC fights, but I will give my favorite raid tier to Sepulcher of the first ones. So thank you guys so much for checking out this video, and be sure and subscribe to me here on YouTube as I'm getting very close to 5,000 subscribers, and follow me over at Twitch at twitch.tv/Mr. Eggplant, because if I do end up getting alpha or beta invites to the Dragonflight alpha or beta, I will be streaming quite often, and that way you'll be able to check out that content. I have a lot more videos planned for you guys, including a new guide for Season 4 for your Marksman Hunter, as well as many other pet taming videos, PvP, Mythic Plus, and so much more. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.